The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Inez Talbot would later say was fitting, because Tuesday had always been the worst day of the week, and nothing about the arrangement her father described within those pages suggested it would be anything other than a catastrophe dressed up in respectability. She read it twice at the kitchen table of their modest home in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1882, while her younger sister Clara pressed against her arm trying to read along, and their father, Randolph Talbot, stood at the window with his back to both of them as though he could not quite bring himself to watch her face when the words landed. The letter explained, in Randolph's careful penmanship, that he had arranged a marriage for her. The man's name was Abel Weston. He was 28 years old, which was a reasonable age, her father had noted in a small parenthetical that felt more like an apology than a fact. He owned land outside of a town called Harlan Creek in the New Mexico Territory. He had cattle. He had a house. He had, according to the letter, the financial means to provide for a wife, and he had written to Randolph through a mutual acquaintance, a man named Porter who had moved west some years prior, expressing that he was in need of a wife and that he had heard the Talbot family had an eldest daughter of marrying age. Inez set the letter down. She was 22 years old. She had taught school for 2 years. She had read every book the Cincinnati Lending Library possessed that was worth reading, and she had opinions about them. She had spent the better part of her adult life imagining that when she married, it would be because she had chosen to, because something inside her chest had ignited in a way she could not argue with, not because her father had struck an arrangement with a stranger who needed a woman the way he needed a new fence post. But there was more to the letter than the arrangement, and that was the part that made it impossible to simply refuse and walk away with her pride intact. Randolph Talbot had debts. Significant ones. The kind that had accumulated quietly over several years, while he maintained the appearance of a man who was managing just fine, and which had now reached the kind of sum that could not be managed at all. The creditors were patient men, but their patience had terms, and those terms were approaching their end. Abel Weston had agreed, through Porter, to settle a portion of those debts in exchange for the arrangement. It was not, her father insisted in the final paragraph of his letter, as terrible as it sounded. Abel Weston was not a cruel man. Porter had vouched for him. He was rough around the edges, yes, because the territory demanded it, but he was not a cruel man. Inez folded the letter precisely along its original creases and placed it back on the table. "Papa," she said quietly, "when does he expect me?" Randolph turned from the window, and she could see on his face the particular expression of a man who loves his daughter and has failed her in the same moment, who is grateful and ashamed in equal measure, and who does not quite know how to carry both things at once. His eyes were red at the corners. He had been crying before she came downstairs, she realized. He had read the letter himself many times before giving it to her. 6 weeks, he said. He'll send the train fare. Inez nodded. She did not cry. She thought she ought to, and she waited for it, but it did not come. What came instead was something quieter and harder, a kind of steady resignation that she recognized as the feeling of a person who has accepted that the story she imagined for herself is not the story she is going to live, and who must decide quickly whether to grieve that or get on with things. She got on with things. She spent those 6 weeks in preparations that were equal parts practical and emotional. She sewed 2 new dresses from fabric she bought with her last 3 months of teaching wages, durable ones in colors that would survive dust and use. She wrote to her friend Harriet, who had cousins in the territory, and asked her what she knew about New Mexico, and Harriet wrote back that it was beautiful and brutal and enormous, and that the sky there was a different kind of sky entirely, bigger than the sky back east in ways that were hard to explain. She read everything she could find about the territory in the library, about the land and the cattle trade and the towns that were springing up along the rail lines, about the ranching life and what it demanded. She also, late on several nights when the house was quiet and Clara was asleep beside her, allowed herself to grieve the version of her life that was not going to happen. She grieved it quietly and completely, and by the time the train fare arrived and she packed her single trunk, she had finished grieving. She had tucked that version of herself away somewhere safe and decided that she would find out who she was in this other story instead. The journey west took 4 days by rail and was the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to her. She watched the landscape transform outside the train window from the soft greens of Ohio to the wide, flat certainty of the plains to something else entirely as they moved into Kansas and then south, the land growing more dramatic and spare, the colors shifting from green to ochre to rust, the sky doing exactly what Harriet had promised, expanding and expanding until it seemed less like something above you and more like something around you. She arrived at the station nearest to Harlan Creek, a place called Dunville, on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The heat surprised her. She had known intellectually that it would be warm, but the quality of the heat was different from what she had experienced before, dry and immediate, pressing against her like a hand laid flat on her skin. There was a wagon waiting. The man holding the reins was not Abel Weston, which she knew because he was elderly and gap-toothed and introduced himself as Cobb Reedy, who worked for Weston and had been sent to collect her and her trunk. He helped her up onto the wagon bench with a courtliness that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance, and they set out down a road that was more suggestion than road, a series of ruts in pale earth that wound through scrubland and past outcroppings of rock the color of dried blood. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "Better part of 2 hours," Cobb said. She had more questions, but she held them. She watched the land instead, its severity, its absolute refusal to be pretty in any conventional sense, and she found that it fascinated her. There was something honest about it. It did not pretend to be comfortable. It simply was what it was, and you could take it or leave it. Abel Weston's land announced itself gradually, the first cattle appearing in the distance and then more, the scrubland giving way to something that had been worked and shaped, a fence line running parallel to the road, a windmill turning slowly against the enormous sky. The house came into view around a bend, and it was larger than she had expected, not fine. Nothing about it was fine, but solid and serious, built of adobe and wood with a covered porch running its full length, surrounded by several outbuildings and a barn that was big enough to speak to a real operation. Abel Weston was standing on the porch. She had not known what to expect, and she had disciplined herself against forming expectations. But even without expectations, the sight of him was something she had to adjust to. He was tall, genuinely tall, with the kind of frame that had been built by work rather than intention, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, with hands she could see even at this distance were the hands of a man who used them constantly and hard. He wore trousers and a plain shirt, no jacket, with boots that were dusty and a hat that had clearly been on a great many rides. His face, as the wagon drew close enough for her to read it, was all angles and weathering, sun-darkened, with a jaw that looked like it had been set and kept at a permanent tension, dark eyes under the brim of the hat, a mouth that was pressed into what she could not yet tell was its natural expression or a deliberate neutrality adopted for this specific moment. He was not handsome in any way she had a word for. He was something else. Compelling, perhaps, in the way that a landscape can be compelling without being gentle. Cobb pulled the wagon up and Inez stepped down herself before anyone could offer a hand, which was perhaps more independent than the moment called for, but she was who she was. "Miss Talbot," Abel said. His voice was lower than she had anticipated and steadier. "Mr. Weston," she replied. They looked at each other for a moment that was neither comfortable nor hostile but purely informational, two people taking stock of the reality of the other person in a way that could not be done through letters or arrangements made by other men. "I'll show you the house," he said. "Thank you," she said, and followed him inside. The interior of the house was clean, which surprised her and then embarrassed her that she had been surprised by it. It was spare, with the kind of furnishings that were chosen for function, but everything was in order. There was a fireplace at one end of the main room, a table with 4 chairs, shelves along one wall holding supplies, and unexpectedly several books. She noticed the books immediately. She could not help it. They were not decorative. They had the worn look of books that had been read. He showed her the kitchen, which was a separate room adjoining the main space and was well equipped for a territory kitchen, with a proper stove and adequate storage. He showed her the 2 bedrooms, one of which he had prepared for her with clean linens and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. He said, without fuss or ceremony, that she was welcome to the space, and that he would not be making any demands on her comfort or person until she was settled and they had come to know each other adequately, which he said with the same flat directness that seemed to characterize everything about him, as though the statement was simply practical and required no elaboration. Inez appreciated the directness even as she was uncertain what to make of the man delivering it. "The books on the shelf," she said, before she could stop herself. "Are those yours?" He paused in the doorway. Something shifted in his expression, small and fast, something that might have been self-consciousness if it had been allowed to fully form, but which was contained almost immediately. "Yes," he said. "What do you read?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment as though measuring something. "Whatever I can get," he said. "Harlan Creek gets a supply wagon from Santa Fe twice a month. I put in an order when there's something worth ordering." She nodded. She wanted to ask more, but she could see that he was not entirely comfortable with the subject, and she did not understand why yet, so she let it rest. Dinner that evening was a meal that Cobb had apparently prepared before departing, left warming on the stove, a stew of beef and dried beans that was plain and good. They sat across from each other at the table and ate, and the silence was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but somewhere in between. The silence of 2 strangers who have agreed to share a life and are working out what that means in practice. He asked her about the journey. She told him about the landscape and the way the sky had changed, and something in his expression shifted again, more openly this time. He said that he had been through Kansas once but had lived most of his life in the territory, and that he sometimes forgot that the land here was extraordinary because he had stopped seeing it from the outside. "You see it clearly enough to say that," she pointed out. He was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I do," he said. She slept well that first night, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake in the unfamiliar dark, listening to the sounds of the territory, the distant calls of animals she could not identify, the wind working at the corners of the adobe, and she did listen to all of those things, but they did not disturb her. They settled around her like a different kind of quiet, and she slept. The days that followed had the quality of a careful negotiation, 2 people learning the dimensions of a shared space and a shared life without any of the usual history or warmth to draw on, building those things from scratch by the smallest accumulation of moments. Abel was up before the sun every morning, out with the cattle and his 2 ranch hands. A quiet young man named Denny and a more experienced older hand named Rufus, who had worked cattle across 3 territories and had opinions about everything related to livestock and nothing else. Inez found her footing in the mornings by making breakfast for everyone, which was not required of her, but which gave her something to do with her hands and her time, while she was still learning what the days here looked like. She discovered that the ranch ran about 200 head of cattle, a significant operation for 1 man and 2 hands, and that Abel managed it with a thoroughness that was evident in how his men spoke to him, with a respect that came from competence rather than fear. She noted the distinction. She had seen how men ran things when they led through fear, and this was not that. She also discovered at the end of the first week that Abel Weston had a difficult time with written words. She found out by accident. She had asked him one evening, when they sat on the porch after dinner in what had become a tentative routine, whether he had received any correspondence lately that needed attention, because she had seen an envelope on the table that had been there for 3 days unopened. He had said, after a pause that contained a quality she had not yet been able to name, that he had not gotten to it. She offered, without thinking, to read it for him. The silence that followed was long enough and particular enough that she looked up from the mending in her lap and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. It was not embarrassment exactly, or not only that. It was something more defended than embarrassment. "It's from the land office in Santa Fe," she said quietly, looking at the envelope. "It likely has deadlines." He looked out at the last of the evening light on the horizon for a long moment. Then he said very evenly, "I can make out most of it. It takes me some time." She understood then. She did not make anything of it, which seemed to be the thing he was watching for most carefully. She simply said that if he wanted another set of eyes on it, she was happy to help, and then she returned to her mending. That night, before bed, he set the envelope on the table beside her chair. She read it to him the next morning over coffee. It was a notice regarding a property boundary survey, routine and requiring a simple written response. She composed the response while he told her what he wanted to say, and she did not remark on the process or on the fact that when he read the letter back to himself, following her finger along the lines, he moved his lips slightly with each word. She simply sat with him and did the work alongside him. She did not yet understand why this felt like the most significant thing that had happened since she arrived, but it did. The following 2 weeks brought Inez deeper into the life of the ranch and deeper, in ways she was not fully tracking, into the orbit of the man who ran it. She learned the rhythms of the place, when the supply wagon came through, what needed to be preserved and what needed to be purchased, which of the ranch's systems required attention and which were running well. She found that she had a natural facility for the organizational demands of running a household at this scale, and a practical competence that she had not known she possessed because Cincinnati had not required it. Abel noticed. He did not say much, because he was not a man who said much, but she could see it in the small adjustments he made, in the way he began including her in conversations about the ranch's planning that he did not need to include her in the way he started leaving the correspondence on the table for her rather than tucking it away with whatever combination of avoidance and effortful private struggle had preceded her arrival. She learned other things too. She learned that he had grown up on a ranch much smaller than this one, in a part of the territory that had since been absorbed into larger operations, and that his parents were both gone. She learned this not through conversation exactly, because Abel was not given to biography, but through the accumulation of small facts that emerged over evenings on the porch and meals, and the occasional walk she took around the property that he sometimes joined. She learned that he had built everything here himself, piece by piece over 8 years, starting with 50 acres and 15 head, and expanding through work that she could see in every callus on his hands and every line around his eyes. She learned, on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after her arrival, that he played the harmonica. She was in the kitchen when she heard it, a low, wandering melody drifting from the porch, tentative and private in a way that suggested he had not expected her to still be awake. She stood at the kitchen window and listened, and the sound of it opened something in her chest that she had been keeping carefully closed, because the music was nothing like the man she had been watching for 3 weeks. It was not rough or efficient or practical. It was genuinely beautiful, slow and searching, the kind of sound a person makes when they are not performing for anyone and when something inside them needs to go somewhere. She did not go out to the porch. She let him have the privacy of it, but in the morning she said, passing him his coffee, "That was lovely last night." He looked up from the table. The self-consciousness was there again, that quick defended thing. "Old habit," he said. "I hope it's not one you plan to lose," she said simply, and went a start on the breakfast. The town of Harlan Creek was a 3-hour ride from the ranch, a proper ride by horse, and not the 2-hour wagon journey that Cobb navigated when he drove into town for supplies. Inez had not yet been to the town, and she wanted to see it. She said so on a Friday morning in her 3rd week, and Abel looked at her with the thoughtful expression she had come to recognize as the way he considered things before he spoke, and said that he was going in the following Monday for supplies, and she was welcome to come. Harlan Creek in the spring of 1882 was a town in the process of becoming something without quite knowing what that something was yet. It had the bones of permanence: a main street with a general store, a livery, a small bank, a hotel that doubled as a saloon on its ground floor, a barbershop, a doctor's office that was also the apothecary, and a church that was still being finished at its eastern end. It also had the overlay of impermanence, a constant coming and going of men who were passing through on their way to somewhere else, dusty and purposeful and indifferent to the town except as a place to resupply. Inez took it all in with the focused attention she applied to everything new, watching, cataloging, understanding. She went into the general store with Abel to fill his order and met the storekeeper, a woman named Frances Doyle who was 50 and brisk, and had been running the store since her husband died 4 years prior, and who took one look at Inez and said, "So you're the one he sent for," with the kind of frank approval that required no elaboration. Inez said she supposed she was, and Frances laughed and said that Harlan Creek had been wondering when Abel Weston was going to do something sensible. She filed that observation away. While Abel loaded the wagon with Denny's help, Inez walked the length of the main street. She passed the hotel and heard the sounds of men inside. She passed the barber shop and nodded to 2 women on the opposite side of the street who she would later learn were the wives of the 2 other ranching families in the area. She paused at the doctor's office because there was a notice posted in the window that read that the town was in need of a school teacher, as the previous one had departed in February and the children had been without schooling for 2 months. She stood at that notice for a long time. When she returned to the wagon, Abel was already there, leaning against the side with his arms folded, waiting without impatience. She said, "Did you know the town needs a teacher?" He looked at her steadily. "I heard that," he said. "I was a teacher in Cincinnati," she said, "before I came." Something moved through his expression, careful and considering. "I know," he said. "Your father mentioned it in his letter." She had not known her father had said that. She thought about it for a moment, about her father writing that detail and what he had intended by it, whether it was relevant information for the arrangement, or whether it was a father's way of making sure someone knew that the woman he was sending out here was a person with a life and a worth beyond the arrangement. "If I were to inquire about the position," she said carefully, watching Abel's face, "would that trouble you?" He did not answer immediately, which she had come to understand was not evasion but thought. He pushed off from the side of the wagon and settled his hat and said, "That would be your decision to make." It was not, she understood, the full answer. "But what do you think?" she pressed. He looked at her. "I think you'd be good at it," he said, and then he went around to the other side of the wagon to climb up. Inez stood on the dusty main street of Harlan Creek and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. It was something warm and surprising, the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who did not need to see her at all. She inquired about the position. She spoke to the man who served as the town's informal council head, a merchant named Grover Hammond who was affable and somewhat long-winded, and who told her that the school building was a single room at the north end of town that could hold perhaps 15 children, that she would be paid a small wage from the town fund, and that she would be expected to teach reading, arithmetic, and such other subjects as she thought necessary. She accepted on the spot. Abel said nothing when she told him on the ride home, only nodded, but she saw the corner of his mouth move in what she had begun to recognize, slowly and carefully, as the nearest thing he had to a smile. She began teaching 3 days a week, on the days when Abel made the ride to town for ranch business, so that they could travel together and she would not be making the journey alone. This arrangement developed naturally, without discussion, which she noticed. She noticed that they had begun to develop an arrangement together without either of them formally proposing the terms, that the life they were sharing had started to find its own shape based on who they each were and what each of them needed. The children were a revelation. There were 11 of them, ranging from 6 to 13, from 3 different families plus several from the town's resident population. Some of them had had schooling before, and some had not. Inez assessed them all in the first week and structured the days to serve each of them where they were, the older ones taking on more complex reading and arithmetic while she worked with the younger ones on their letters, which she had always found to be among the most satisfying things in the world. Watching a child discover that the marks on a page had meaning and that the meaning was available to them. She came home from her first full week of teaching exhausted and alive with it, full of the day, in a way she had not been full of anything since she arrived. She sat down at the dinner table and told Abel about the children, about which ones were quick and which ones needed more time, and about a boy named Thomas who was 9 and who had cried when he successfully read his first complete sentence because he had been told by someone, she did not know who, that he was too slow to read. Abel listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, very quietly, "Some people get told that and they believe it their whole lives." The way he said it made her still. She looked at him across the table and understood, with a clarity that felt like a door opening, that he was not speaking hypothetically. She thought about the letters on the table. She thought about the way he had contained himself when she offered to read to him, that defended, careful containment. She thought about a child somewhere in this territory being told that he was too slow to read, and the man across from her building a cattle ranch large enough to employ 2 men and run 200 head, and managing the reading that was required of that because he was determined and capable in every way that mattered, even when it was hard. She wanted to say something that would not land wrong. She chose, in the end, to say nothing beyond what she said next morning, which was to place a simple reader on the table beside the coffee, one of the ones she had brought from the school, and to say as she handed him his cup that she had an extra one if he wanted something to look at in the evenings. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands and set it down. He did not say anything. But it was still on the table a week later, and she had seen him at it on 2 separate evenings, the lamplight falling across his bent head and his moving lips, the quiet concentration of a man teaching himself something he had been told he could not have. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know a season is changing, not in a single moment but in the accumulated weight of many small ones, each adding itself to the last until the evidence was undeniable. She had not expected it. She had expected, at best, a workable arrangement, a mutual respect built on practical compatibility, which would be better than many marriages she had observed, even those formed in the conventional way. She had not expected to lie awake listening to the wind and thinking about the way he had said that some people believe it their whole lives, or about the harmonica music she heard some evenings drifting from the porch, or about the way he had looked at her when she said she hoped it was not a habit he planned to lose, that unguarded moment before the guard came back up. What she could not yet read was whether any of it was mutual. Abel Weston was, as her father had accurately reported, rough. He was direct to the point of curtness sometimes, spare with words in ways that could be mistaken for coldness, and he kept a quality of distance around himself that she had come to think of as not absence but protection, the careful management of something interior that he did not let out easily. He was not cold. She knew that much. She had seen him with Denny, who was barely 20 and inexperienced and made mistakes that a less patient man would have lit into hard, and she had seen Abel correct him with a flat evenness that took the sting out of the correction without losing the instruction. She had seen him with the cattle, which was a different kind of observation, a man at work in his element, moving through the herd with a quiet authority that the animals responded to. She had seen him on the evening 3 weeks into her teaching when she came home tired and a little dispirited because Thomas had had a hard day, and she was second-guessing one of her methods, and Abel had set a plate in front of her without a word, and the plate had a piece of the dried apple that she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks prior that she liked, which meant he had thought to get it specifically when he was in town that morning. That was the kind of man he was. Not the kind who said things in large words, but the kind who put a piece of dried apple on your plate because he had listened when you spoke and remembered what you said. She was very much in love with him. The question was what to do about it, given that the nature of their arrangement had not yet resolved into anything more than a careful cohabitation, and she was not sure whether Abel was regarding the arrangement as a permanent state or as a prelude to something he was also waiting to understand. The resolution came, as most resolutions do, sideways and unplanned. It was a Saturday in late June, a day when Abel had no particular ranch business in town and Inez had no school, and they had both been working around the property in the morning. She in the kitchen garden that she had been establishing over the past weeks, and he at some fencing repair on the west side of the property. They had crossed paths at midday, eaten a simple meal together, and then in the afternoon the heat had become the kind that was better survived on the porch with a glass of cool water than in any active pursuit. They sat on the porch, and the silence was the comfortable kind now, the kind they had grown into over 2 months of evenings, and Inez was reading and Abel had the reader she had given him open in his lap, and she saw him pause at something and look up and then look at the words again with a small concentration that she found so unexpectedly dear that she had to look away. She heard him clear his throat. "I want to ask you something," he said. She lowered her book. "All right," she said. He was looking out at the land, not at her, and she could see the jaw set and the hand still on the reader in his lap. "I know how this came about," he said. "The arrangement. I know your father's situation, and I know that you didn't come here because you chose to." She held herself very still. "I told myself when Porter wrote to me that it was practical," he said, "that I needed someone who could manage the house and I had things I could offer in return. That was the honest truth when I said it." He paused. She did not fill the pause. "It isn't the full truth now," he said. His voice was very even. She understood that the evenness was costing him something. "I don't want you here because of the arrangement, Inez. I want you here because of who you are. Because you saw those books on the shelf and asked me about them before you asked me about the cattle or the land or anything else. Because you read that letter to me like it was the most ordinary thing in the world when I was waiting for you to say something about it that would have made me close up entirely. Because you started a kitchen garden nobody asked you to start, and you teach those children like they're worth all of it, which they are." He stopped. He turned his head and looked at her directly. "I don't know how to say these things with any grace. I'm telling you that plainly because you deserve to know it plainly." Inez set her book down on the arm of her chair. Her hands were not entirely steady. She thought about everything she had been holding in careful reserve for 2 months, and she thought about what it meant that this man had been holding the same quality of reserve, and she thought about what it felt like to be seen plainly by someone who meant every word they said because they did not say words they did not mean. "Abel," she said. He waited. "I came here because I had to," she said carefully. "But I stayed because I wanted to, and I have wanted to for a long time now. That is also the plain truth." He looked at her. The guard was down, fully and completely, and what was underneath it was extraordinary. Not soft exactly, because nothing about Abel Weston was soft, but open in a way that transformed the whole face, the eyes alive with something that had been there all along under the careful management of it, a warmth and an intelligence and a longing that she recognized because she had been carrying the same things. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His was large and rough and certain, and hers fit inside it in a way that felt like an answer to a question she had been asking without words for 2 months. They sat on the porch until the sun went down, holding hands, and talking in the way they had never quite talked before, with the walls down, telling each other things. He told her about growing up on the small ranch with his father, who had not been an unkind man but had not had much patience for a boy who struggled with reading, and who had made him feel the struggle as a deficiency rather than a challenge to be worked around. He told her about leaving at 17 to work cattle with a larger outfit, about learning the land from the inside as a working man, about saving every dollar for 8 years until he had enough to buy this parcel and build this house. She told him about the life she had imagined for herself in Cincinnati, not with bitterness, but with the honesty of someone who had made peace with a different life and found it to be better than the imagined one. She told him about the students she had loved over 2 years of teaching, about the specific joy of it, and about how finding the school here had felt like finding a thread back to herself in a place that had initially felt entirely foreign. He listened to every word. They were married in the Harlan Creek Church on a Saturday in August, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by Francis Doyle and Cobb Reedy and Rufus and Denny, and the families of several of her students, who came because she had told them about it, and because, in a small community, the events of people's lives belong in some way to the whole community. Abel stood at the front of the incomplete church with the late summer light coming through the unfinished east wall, and he looked at her as she walked toward him with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, that open, unguarded thing that the porch had shown her first, the man inside the rough exterior standing forward and present and entirely hers. She said yes to the minister's questions with her whole self behind the words. He said yes the same way. Francis Doyle cried, which surprised everyone including Francis. The months after the wedding deepened into something that Inez had not fully had words for at the start, but which revealed itself gradually as the life she had not dared to imagine when she was sitting at the kitchen table in Cincinnati reading her father's letter. It was not a fine life in the sense of elegance or ease. There was constant work, the land demanded it, and the territory demanded it, and there were days when the wind was brutal and the heat was an adversary, and things went wrong in the way that things on a working ranch go wrong. A sick calf, a fence down in the night, a supply delay from Santa Fe that left them short on essentials for 2 weeks. But it was full. Every day was full of work and purpose, and the particular pleasure of being genuinely known by another person, which Inez had not until now understood was the central thing, the thing that made everything else possible. Abel continued with the reader she had given him. He was, she discovered, methodical and relentless about it in the way he was methodical and relentless about everything he had decided to do, working at it in the evenings the same way he approached any difficult problem on the ranch, with patience and persistence, and a complete refusal to let difficulty mean defeat. He made progress that he kept private, but she caught the evidence of it, new words absorbed and used in conversation, the letters on the table read with less effortful pause, a book from his shelf replaced with another from the supply order, this one with longer chapters. She never made anything of it directly. She simply was present beside it, as he had been present beside her when she was finding her footing in the new life, and she thought that this was perhaps what love was in practice, not the dramatic gestures but the steady willingness to sit beside someone while they were doing the work of becoming. In October, she wrote to her father. She had written brief letters before, practical ones reporting that she was well, but this was the first full letter, the kind that told him who she had become out here and what the life looked like from the inside. She told him about the school and the children and about Thomas, who had by now read 3 complete books and whose confidence had undergone a transformation that was visible in his face and his posture when he walked into the classroom. She told him about the land, about the specific quality of the light in the territory in the autumn, golden and sideways and extraordinarily clean. She told him about Abel, about who he actually was beneath the description that had made him sound like a thing to be married rather than a person to be known. She also asked her father, carefully and without pressure, whether he might consider coming to visit the following spring if his circumstances allowed. She asked it because she had forgiven him, fully and without reservation, and she thought he should know that, and she thought the best way to tell him was to invite him into the life that had come from his difficult decision. Randolph Talbot wrote back within 3 weeks, a letter that was longer than any he had sent before, and that ended with the words, "I am more relieved and more ashamed and more proud of you than I know how to say, and yes, I will come in the spring." The winter in the territory was unlike any winter Inez had known, cold at night in a way that was genuinely severe, the temperatures dropping to something that required the fireplace to be kept going through the dark hours, but dry and clear in a way that was different from the gray, sodden winters of Ohio. The stars in the winter sky were extraordinary, brilliant and close-seeming, and on several nights she and Abel stood on the porch bundled in coats and looked at them together, talking or not talking, easy in the shared silence in a way that she thought would take most people years to find, and which they had found in months because they had been honest with each other from the moment honesty had been possible. She also began to suspect, around the turn of December, that she was expecting a child. She was certain of it by Christmas. She told Abel on a Sunday morning, sitting at the table with the Christmas light coming pale and cold through the window. She simply said, "I think we are going to have a child in the summer." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that was larger and more complex than anything the face usually held, moving through wonder and fear, and something else she could only call a kind of reverent gladness, the expression of a man to whom something has been given that he was not expecting, and which he understands to be the greatest thing. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" he said, which was so characteristically Abel, the first question being not about himself but about her, that she laughed, which was perhaps not the response he was expecting but which made his expression shift into that barely there smile she loved. "I am very well," she said. He raised her hands to his lips, both of them, one after the other, and said nothing more for a moment, and the nothing was full of everything. They told Cobb on Christmas Day, which was a tradition at the ranch, a shared meal on the porch when the weather allowed, and Cobb received the news with the gravity of a man who has been alone a long time, and for whom the news of a new life arriving somewhere he has come to think of as his place carries a specific weight. He took off his hat and said, "Well, that's a fine thing, Mr. Weston," and then looked at Inez and said, "You're going to be the making of this place, Miss Inez." And Inez thought that the title Miss was a holdover from the beginning of her time here that Cobb had never been able to entirely let go of, and she found she did not mind it. January brought two things: the deepest cold of the season, during which they were largely confined to the house and the immediate outbuildings, and the arrival of a decision that Abel had been working toward for several months, and which he told her about one evening by the fire with the quiet, methodical care he brought to things he had thought through completely. He wanted to expand the operation. Not dramatically, not in a way that outpaced their means, but deliberately, another 50 head and another hand to manage them, and a second water source on the eastern portion of the property that he had been working out the engineering for with Denny, who had some facility for that kind of problem. He laid out the plan, the costs and the timeline and the expected returns, and he asked her what she thought. She thought it was sound. She also thought it was characteristic of him that he had asked her. She had noticed this from early on, the way he brought her into decisions that another man in this time and place might regard as entirely his own province. She thought about what that meant, about who he was, and about how the arrangements that the world made for women out of convention and convenience sat so differently, when the man within the arrangement regarded you as a mind worth consulting rather than a presence to be maintained. She told him it was sound, and she told him why she thought so, and they talked through the details together until the fire burned low, and then they sat together with the warmth of it against the cold outside, and she thought that this was what she had come west to find, even though she had not known she was looking for it. Spring arrived with the particular drama of the territory, the land greening in ways it had not been during the gray months, the cattle restless with it, the sky shifting from the winter's hard blue to something deeper and more various. Inez's body was changing with the season, the pregnancy visible now and requiring adjustments to the school schedule, which she managed by speaking plainly to Grover Hammond about her situation and asking that they arrange for coverage on days when she was not able to manage the ride to town. Francis Doyle stepped in, which surprised everyone including Inez, and then surprised no one who actually knew Frances. Because Frances Doyle was a woman who could do whatever she decided to do, and she had apparently decided that the school was worth keeping running, and that she had opinions about arithmetic that were worth imparting to children. Inez continued teaching 2 days a week through April and into May, and the children accepted her changed condition with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of children who live in a place where the processes of life and land are not hidden from them. Thomas, her first-year student, had by this point become something approaching the best reader in the school, which was a transformation so complete that his mother had come in to see Inez 3 months after his breakthrough to tell her, with eyes that were not quite dry, that she did not know what Inez had done, but that her boy was an entirely different child, and she was grateful beyond her ability to say it. Inez had said that Thomas had done it himself, which was true, and that he had needed only to understand that the capability had been there all along. Randolph Talbot arrived in the 2nd week of May, on the supply wagon from Dunville, carrying a single bag and looking both older than she remembered and somehow younger, the way people can look when they have shed a weight they have been carrying for a long time. His debts, which had been the origin of everything, had been settled through Weston's assistance as agreed, and he had spent the intervening year rebuilding something smaller and more honest in Cincinnati, a clerical position with a shipping firm that he was neither proud nor ashamed of, simply grateful for. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch, and then he looked at his daughter, visibly expecting in her 6th month, standing on the porch of a solid house in the middle of an extraordinary territory, and something in his face did what faces do when reality exceeds every hope you had for a decision that could have gone terribly wrong. Abel met him in the yard. There was a moment between them that Inez observed from the porch, the 2 men taking each other in, the older man with the weight of what he had done in the transaction of it all still somewhere on him, and the younger man who was the other side of that transaction, and something passed between them that she thought was more complex than forgiveness and simpler than gratitude. Abel extended his hand and Randolph shook it, and that was the whole of what was said, but it seemed to be enough. Randolph stayed 2 weeks. He was good with the children, patient in a way that recalled the father she had known before the debts had made him anxious and diminished, and she thought the territory agreed with him the way it had agreed with her, the enormity of it putting smaller things in their proper scale. He sat with Abel on the porch on several evenings, and they talked about cattle and land in the way men talk when they are finding what they have in common, and Inez sat with them sometimes, and sometimes gave them the space to find their own terms. The night before he left, she sat with him alone on the porch after Abel had gone inside, and she said what she had been saving for the right moment. She said, "I know this was hard for you to do, Papa, and I know you were afraid of what it would mean for me." He was quiet for a moment. "I was," he said. "It is a good life," she said. "It is a very good life." He looked out at the dark land and the brilliant stars, and then he looked at her and he said, "He's a good man." "He is," she said. "He is something else entirely." The summer arrived with its full force and weight, the heat of it enormous and dry, the sky a blue that was almost aggressive in its intensity. And in the 1st week of July, on a night that had cooled to something bearable with the help of the evening wind, Inez Weston labored through the hours between dusk and dawn while Abel sat outside the bedroom door in a chair and did not sleep and could not leave. The doctor from Harlan Creek, a taciturn man named Dr. Harcastle, who had delivered perhaps 100 children in the territory, came for the birth and managed it with competent efficiency. Francis Doyle had also come, ostensibly to help but primarily, Inez suspected, because Francis was constitutionally incapable of being nearby when something significant was happening and not being present for it. The child arrived in the gray hours before sunrise. A boy, healthy and loud, with dark eyes that in the first hours seemed to hold an accusation toward the world that had just introduced itself so abruptly. Abel was called in. Inez watched him see his son for the first time. She watched the face do what it had done when she told him at Christmas, that complex large thing but amplified and more profound, and she watched him take the child in his large rough hands with a care that was so absolute and so natural that it undid her entirely, and she cried for the first time since she had sat at the kitchen table in Cincinnati reading her father's letter. "What will we name him?" she asked. Abel looked at her over the head of the sleeping child. He had thought about this. She could see he had thought about it. "Thomas," he said, "if you'd like it." She looked at him for a long moment, thinking about a 9-year-old boy in a one-room school being told he could read, and about the man across from her being told long ago that he could not, and about the way those two things were connected in the interior life of someone she knew better now than she had ever known anyone. "I would like it very much," she said. Thomas Abel Weston was named on a Sunday morning in July, in the finished Harlan Creek Church, with Frances Doyle godmother and Cobb Reedy godfather, a pairing that Frances announced was not her first choice, but that she supposed she could live with, and Cobb received this with the equanimity of a man who had been tolerating stronger personalities than Frances Doyle for his entire working life. The years that followed were years of accumulation, the kind of accumulation that is the actual substance of a life, not dramatic in the way that singular events are dramatic, but rich in a way that singular events are not. The ranch expanded as Abel had planned, another 50 head added before Thomas's first birthday, a new barn built the following spring, the eastern water source engineered and running by the second autumn. Denny proved to have more capacity than his early youth had suggested, and Abel gave him more responsibility, and Denny responded to it by becoming the kind of hand who could be trusted with anything, which was the outcome Abel had been patient toward without saying so. Inez taught school for 2 more years after Thomas was born, taking the academic year and stopping before each summer. The school grew, more children arriving as Harlan Creek grew, and by the time she stopped teaching full-time, there were 17 children in the school, and Grover Hammond had organized enough funding to hire a permanent teacher, a young woman from Santa Fe named Miss Delacroix, who came with her own set of opinions and methods, and who Inez spent a full week with before the handover, making sure that Thomas Vasquez's progress was understood and protected, and that the other students who needed particular attention were seen. Abel's reading continued to improve through those years in the quiet, private way he had always managed it. She observed the progress without commenting on it directly except on one evening, about 2 years into their marriage, when she came into the main room and found him at the table with one of his own books, the one he had ordered from Santa Fe, and which was longer and more complex than anything he had attempted before, reading it in the lamplight with a concentration that was still careful but no longer labored. He did not know she was there for a moment. She watched him read the way she had watched him do everything at his best, with total focus and a kind of quiet determination that was, she thought, the central quality of him, the thing that had built this ranch and this life from almost nothing. He looked up and saw her, and she smiled at him. He said, "Don't look so pleased with yourself." She said, "I had nothing to do with it." He held her gaze for a moment. "You had everything to do with it," he said simply. They had a second child 3 years after Thomas, a girl they named Clara, for Inez's sister, who came out to visit when Clara was 4 months old, and who fell in love with the territory in a way that surprised her and did not surprise Inez at all, because she had come to believe that the land here had a way of taking hold of people who were ready to be taken hold of. Clara Talbot, the younger sister, wrote to Inez 6 months after her visit that she was thinking about the teacher's post at the school in Harlan Creek, And did Inez think it was worth inquiring? Inez wrote back that she thought it was absolutely worth inquiring, and that the Weston Ranch had a spare room and a permanent invitation. Clara Talbot arrived in the spring of the following year and took the teaching post and stayed. She was 24, and the land agreed with her in the way it had agreed with her sister. And she found, within 2 years, that Denny the ranch hand, now 25 and considerably more substantial a man than the nervous boy who had first arrived at Abel's operation, had opinions worth hearing and a quality of steady goodness that she had not expected and could not argue with. When she wrote to tell Inez that she and Denny were to be married, Inez read the letter at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the land and thought about Tuesday mornings in Cincinnati and letters that change everything. And she felt a fullness that had no adequate name, but that she had come to recognize as the feeling of a life that has exceeded every expectation you were careful enough not to have. Randolph Talbot came back to the territory the spring after Clara's wedding. He came and he stayed longer this time, 6 weeks, and he spent a great deal of the time with his grandchildren, Thomas, who was now 4 and strongly resembled his father in the set of his jaw and the directness of his gaze, and Clara, who was a sunny and determined 11-month-old, who appeared to have decided that the world was an interesting place that she intended to fully investigate. Randolph held the baby on the porch in the evenings with a peace on his face that Inez found deeply comforting, the peace of a man who has seen the consequence of his choices and found them to be better than he deserved, and who has decided to simply be grateful for that. On the last evening of his visit, Randolph sat with Inez and Abel on the porch after the children were asleep, the 3 of them quiet together, and he said, after a long and comfortable silence, "I have been afraid of many things in my life. I was afraid of what I was doing when I arranged this. I was afraid it was wrong." Neither Inez nor Abel said anything. They let him have the words. "I believe," he said carefully, "that Providence is a thing that works through crooked means sometimes and arrives somewhere better than the crooked means would suggest." Abel, who had said nothing, turned his cup in his hands and looked out at the night. "I believe that too," he said. Inez reached over and took both their hands, her father's on one side and her husband's on the other, and the 3 of them sat in the dark with the territory stretching out in every direction, enormous and beautiful and honest, and the stars overhead doing what they always did out here, filling the sky in a way that made everything feel both very small and very significant at once. Randolph left the next morning, and the ranch settled back into its rhythms. The autumn brought a particularly good season for the cattle, Abel's expansion having proved sound in the way that sound planning tends to prove itself over time, and the ranch turned a real profit for the first time at the scale Abel had been building toward. He did not make much of it, because he was not a man who made much of anything he had achieved, but Inez noticed that some quality of tension she had not fully registered, a deep-settled vigilance that had been in him since the beginning and which she had come to understand as the vigilance of a man who had been building for a long time without knowing whether it would work, was quieter now. Not gone, because that kind of vigilance does not simply leave a man who has built it over years, but quieter, settled into something that resembled security. She told him one evening, when they were finishing the accounts together at the table, a routine they had developed over the past year, her facility with numbers being more practiced than his, and his grasp of the ranch's operational needs being more complete than hers, that the operation was in the best position it had ever been. He looked at the figures and then looked at her. "Because of you," he said. "Because of both of us," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I built the cattle end of it," he said. "You built the rest. The accounts, the correspondence, the organization of the house and the planning. I would have been carrying all of that on my own before you came, and it would have been less well done and I would have been half the man. You would have been entirely yourself," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who had been described to her as rough, and who was rough in every way the description had intended, rough-handed and rough-edged and weathered by a hard life in hard country, and who was also, underneath all of that roughness, something she had been finding the measure of for years now and still felt she had not fully mapped. Something careful and devoted and deeply, privately tender. Something that played harmonica on the porch in the evenings when he thought no one was listening. Something that named his son after a struggling student and sat in a chair outside a bedroom door all through a long night without sleeping, because he could not be elsewhere. Something that had asked her once on a porch in August if she had chosen to stay, or if she had only stayed because she had to, not to know the answer, but because the asking was what mattered to him, whether she was here because she wanted to be. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I am here because I want to be," she said, which was the answer she had given once and which she meant now in a deeper and more inhabited way than she had been able to mean it then. "I am here because this is the only place I want to be." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. The winter that year was mild by territory standards, and Christmas was expansive and warm. Cobb at the table as always, and now Clara and Denny too. Denny somewhat overwhelmed by the fullness of the table after years of eating on the range and trying not to show it, and Thomas the 4-year-old performing a complete and entirely fictional account of the ranch's operations that Cobb listened to with seriousness that the story did not deserve. And baby Clara in Inez's arms being passed to various arms throughout the meal, because she was at the age where the whole world was interesting, and everyone in it a potential study. Abel sat at the head of his table and looked at what was there, and Inez, watching him from the other end, saw it again, that open thing, the interior man fully present, the roughness a surface on something that was not rough at all. She thought of her sister Clara, who had not been able to read the end of the letter that brought her here, who had gone to sleep while Inez was still reading, and who had therefore never heard the line that described Abel as rough around the edges. She thought that even if she had heard it, it would not have prepared her or dissuaded her, because rough around the edges was a description of the container, not the content, and everything about who Abel was beneath it had revealed itself in time and continued to reveal itself, each year adding a new layer to what she knew of him, and each layer confirming what she had first understood on a porch in the summer, that there was more here than the roughness, that there was something extraordinary here. Something built of hard work and quiet intelligence, and a love that he did not say easily, but which was present in every dried apple on a plate, and every chair outside a bedroom door, and every question about whether she was here by choice. In the spring of the year Thomas turned 5, Inez discovered she was expecting again. She told Abel in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which she noted with a private and somewhat rueful amusement, because Tuesdays had always been the worst day of the week. He set down the cup he was holding and looked at her with the same large and complex expression she had come to love for its completeness, its refusal to be only one thing. "Is Tuesday still the worst day of the week?" he asked. She stared at him. She had never told him that. She was certain she had never told him that. He smiled, which was rare enough and warm enough that she felt it in her chest every time. "You said it once in your sleep," he said. "A long time ago." She shook her head slowly. "You are something else entirely, Abel Weston," she said. "I know," he said, and picked up his cup again as though that settled the matter. The third child was born that autumn, another boy, delivered by Dr. Harcastle with his usual efficiency, who they named James, for Abel's father, whom Abel had not been close to in the ways that counted but whom he had come to regard with an understanding that age and distance and the having of children of his own had made available. James Weston was a round and emphatic infant with strong opinions about everything that came anywhere near him and a quality of determination that, Cobb said sagely over the baby's first introduction to the wider household, put him in mind of his father at that age, which Cobb could not possibly have known, but said with such conviction that it became the family understanding. Thomas the elder, Inez's former student, came to the ranch to visit that winter with his mother, who had become a friend over the years of Inez's teaching and after. He was 12 now, tall and quiet in the manner of a boy who reads a great deal and lives a good deal of his life in the interior. And he looked at the baby James, and then at the Weston household in general with the alert attention of a child who knows he has been somewhere formative and is beginning to understand why. He spent an hour on the porch with Abel, which surprised Inez until she thought about it, and she realized she was not surprised at all, because Abel Weston was the kind of man that boys who had been told they were less than they were would seek out, sensing without being able to say why that this was a man who understood that. She watched them from the kitchen window, the tall rancher and the 12-year-old boy, both of them looking out at the land, and she thought about the world making space for people in ways the world does not always get credit for. The years continued to accumulate. Harlan Creek grew into something more substantial, a proper town now with a school that had 2 rooms and a dedicated building, and 3 teachers including Clara, who had become the most experienced of them, and who ran her classroom with a combination of warmth and firm expectation that her students responded to by becoming competent and confident readers, which she said was the only outcome that interested her. Denny and Clara had a child of their own, a boy they named Fletcher, who was 8 months younger than James Weston, and who would grow up as a near-constant companion to both James and the elder Thomas, the 3 of them forming a natural unit in the way that children in communities do. Abel's operation continued to grow in the careful, deliberate way he did everything, adding to the herd and the land and the hands over the years without ever overextending, managing the operation with the combination of practical intelligence and deep knowledge of the land that was, everyone who dealt with him in Harlan Creek agreed, the reason the Weston Ranch was one of the most consistently successful in the area. He was known in the territory as a man whose word was good and whose judgment was sound, the kind of reputation that accumulates slowly from the consistent evidence of both and which cannot be manufactured. Inez had stopped teaching formally by the time James was a year old, not because she did not love it, but because the ranch and the family and the various organizational and correspondence demands of the operation occupied her time fully. But she was, in a way, still teaching, in the school she had created at the kitchen table for Thomas, and eventually for Clara, and eventually for James. And in the evening hours she spent with Abel as his reading continued to improve, the 2 of them sometimes simply reading in the same room in the companionable parallel way, she with a novel and he with a history of the Southwest that he had ordered and was working through methodically. He finished the history one April evening and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "Good?" she asked. "Good," he said. He paused. "I'd like to order something else." "What would you like?" she asked. He thought about it. "Something with more story in it," he said. She smiled. She wrote the order the next morning for a novel she had loved in Cincinnati, one with a great deal of story in it. And when it came on the supply wagon 3 weeks later, she set it on the table beside his coffee, and he picked it up and read the first page with the focused deliberateness of a man who has learned something hard and earned the use of it. And she thought that this was one of the things she would remember always, the sight of Abel Weston reading a story because he wanted to and because he could. Thomas, the eldest Weston child, turned 10 in the summer, and was by this age so thoroughly his father's son in bearing and temperament that strangers in Harlan Creek sometimes did a double-take when they saw the boy beside the man, the same straight-back directness, the same economy of expression, the same eyes that were more alive than the stillness of the face around them suggested. He had his mother's quickness, though, the fast-reading intelligence that made lateral connections and asked questions that were 2 steps ahead of where the conversation was. And he had her humor, which was drier and more frequent than his father's, and which Abel received with the private amusement of a man who has been surprised by the same thing many times, and finds that he does not mind. Clara Weston, at 7, was the personality of the family in the way that second children often are, louder and more immediate and more interested in the social dimensions of every situation than her brother. With her mother's dark hair and her own particular quality of certainty that expressed itself in the way she walked into rooms, as though she had already decided they were interesting, and was merely confirming it. She had been reading since 4, which was an early start that Inez had not pushed but had simply made available, and she read with a voracity that pleased her parents and occasionally inconvenienced them, because she read whenever she could, including at meals, which Abel had attempted to discourage, and which Inez had attempted to enforce, both of them undermined by the fact that they recognized the behavior and were not entirely opposed to it. James at 3 was his own distinct entity, the round-faced emphatic infant having developed into a round-faced emphatic toddler with opinions about everything, and a relationship with the horses in the barn that was both early and intense, spending as much time as he was allowed in there, and demonstrating, even at 3, an ease with the animals that the hands noted with the specific interest of people who can recognize in a very small child the early signs of a natural horseman. Inez looked at her 3 children on the ordinary evenings of their ordinary lives and felt the completeness of it. Not a completeness that closed things off, not the completeness of a story that has ended, but the completeness of something that has found its own full shape. That is precisely what it is meant to be. She stood on the porch one October evening, when the light was doing the particular thing it did at that time of year, that golden slant that made the land look like something in a painting, and listened to the harmonica drifting from the far side of the porch, where Abel was sitting with his back against the wall, and his legs stretched out, playing the same wandering melody she had heard that first time through the kitchen window, and had not let herself interrupt. She went and sat beside him, leaning her shoulder against his, and he continued to play. The melody found its way through several phrases and then settled into something slower and quieter, and the land stretched out in front of them in the evening light, and the children were inside and the cattle were settled and the stars were beginning to show at the east end of the sky. He stopped playing and rested the harmonica on his knee. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About how I wrote to Porter and told him I needed a wife," he said, "and about what I meant by that and what it turned out to mean." She waited. "I thought I needed someone to run the house," he said. "I thought I needed practical help and a woman who could manage the domestic side of the operation. I thought I was making a sensible arrangement." "You were," she said. "I was being an idiot," he said. She laughed. The quiet, genuine laugh that she had found over the years of their marriage was one of the things he seemed most to seek, the evidence of her amusement, which he pursued with the same steady persistence he brought to everything else. "You were doing the best you knew how to do," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. "My best was being an idiot, and then you arrived and you asked about the books." He paused. "That's the thing I go back to. You stepped off that wagon after 4 days on a train and a 2-hour ride in the dust, and the first thing you did was ask about the books. It was the first interesting thing I noticed," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and his face in the evening light had the openness she had been the beneficiary of for years, and which still moved her in the same way it always had, the interior man forward and present, the roughness neither erased nor hidden, but simply not the whole story. "I don't know how to say what you are to me," he said. "I have tried to find the words for it and I don't have them." "You have always found other ways to say it," she said. He nodded. He picked up the harmonica again and looked at it and then out at the land. "I am going to do better," he said. "With the reading, I want to be able to write things to you, letters, things I want to say that I can't say out loud." She felt the warmth of it spread through her chest. "I would love that," she said. "It will take some time," he said. "We have time," she said. He put the harmonica to his lips and played, and she sat against his shoulder and listened, and the October evening settled around them in the way evenings had settled around them for years now, with the quality of something earned and chosen and absolutely real. and the stars came out one by one over the territorial sky that was bigger than any sky she had known before she came here. And the Weston Ranch was quiet and full in the way that things are quiet when they have found their proper place. The first letter arrived on her birthday the following February, slipped under the door of the kitchen before she came down in the morning. It was 3 sentences, written in Abel's careful and still developing hand, the words chosen with the economy of a man who considers each one, and it said, "You came here because you had to. You stayed because you chose to. Everything I have built here is because of the second thing, and everything worth having is because of you." She held it in both hands at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she got up and found him on the porch in the gray morning cold, already up and watching the land warm into the day, and she stood in front of him and he looked at her and saw what was in her face. "It took me a long time to get those sentences right," he said. "They are exactly right," she said. He pulled her to him, and she put her head against his chest, and they stood there in the February cold on the porch of the ranch he had built from nothing in the territory that had remade her entirely. And the morning came up around them with the particular light of the Southwest, clean and honest, and without apology, the same light that had been there on the first afternoon she arrived, and which she had learned to love in the way she had learned to love everything here, by being present with it every day until it was part of her. Inside the house, Thomas Weston, the eldest, began making the morning noise of a 10-year-old, and Clara's voice rose in response to something, and from the direction of James's room came the urgent vocalization of a 3-year-old who had decided that morning had arrived, and that the family's awareness of this was required immediately. Abel sighed against her hair. "The morning," he said. "The morning," she agreed, but she did not move for one more moment, holding the letter in one hand and the warmth of him in the other, and she thought. Tuesday mornings in Cincinnati, a letter on a table, a father at a window with his back turned, and a road going west into a country so vast and so honest that it made a new life possible for anyone willing to come to it with their whole self open. She had come. She had stayed. She was home. She went inside to start the coffee, and Abel followed her, and the day began.